Since the beginning, Dungeons & Dragons has featured all manner of fantastical creatures. Elves, dwarves, hobbits, trolls, dragons, and many more. However, in the fall of 1976, an exciting new mythical creature was introduced to the game. Women. Yes, the secret to incorporating these exotic fey creatures of shimmering moonlight and dancing shadow had long eluded dungeon masters and players alike. That is until October 1976, and issue 3 of The Dragon, and the article, Notes on Women and Magic, Bringing the Distaff Gamer into D&D. And for those of you who, like myself, are not familiar with the word distaff, it is a tool used in spinning, which then became a noun adjunct for referring to something as being related to women. And I do not know enough about the language that was in use in the 1970s and also the Midwest to know if there was any specific connotation to this word choice. Now, variant rules for female characters are and have been a thing since, well, I believe October 1976, and an issue of contention for just as long. And I am not going to get into that much larger and more nuanced topic here because, honestly, this is just a silly lol, let's look at some cringe rules from 1976 video. Now, if you watched my video on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, you might be expecting this to be something similar, just a simple limiting of female character strength. But this isn't Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, this is Dungeons & Dragons Rules for Fantastic Medieval Wargames campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. And nothing is simple here. So yes, obviously we do have variant attribute generation for female characters, but so much more than that, we have a complete set of alternate classes for female characters. Now, mind you, a complete set of classes was just 4 classes at the time, but still, I mean, that is something. So now let's hop into this situation and see what it's all about. There will be 4 major groups in which women may enter. They may be fighters, magic users, thieves, and clerics. They may progress to the level of men in the area of magic and, in some ways, surpass men as thieves. Elven women may rise especially high in levels in cleric to the elves. Only as fighters are women clearly behind in all cases, but even they have attributes that their male counterparts do not. So let's look at the new rules for attribute generation for female characters. Now, in your standard Dungeon & Dragon, you roll 3d6 for all of your attributes. But here, if your character happens to have lady lumps, instead of 3d6, you roll your strength with 1 8-sided die and 1 6-sided die. And in place of charisma, you have a beauty score, which is rolled with 2d10, or rather, 2 20-sided die numbered 1 through 10, because d10s as we know them did not actually exist until 1980, which isn't incredibly relevant to this particular topic, it's just one of those things that I really like pointing out. And here is where I begin the criticism, and not even on the idea of beauty being the female equivalent of charisma, despite charisma specifically being defined as a combination of appearance, personality, and so forth. No, I'll have lots of time to talk about that later. For now, I want to nitpick the actual generation rules here, because if I were to ask you, which is higher, 3d6 or 2d10, you may reasonably say 2d10 because it has a higher maximum value and a higher mean value. However, when you start looking at the distribution, while you do have a higher chance of rolling above average, you also have an almost equally high chance of rolling below average when compared to 3d6. And it is one of those things where I have to question if the designer just didn't understand the math there, or if it was an intentional decision to have beauty less centrally weighted. Especially considering the fact that they have you roll strength with a d6 and a d8, and they could have very easily just said roll beauty with 2d6 and 1d8. But things are only going to get worse from here, so let's just move on to the Fighting Woman. So all of the class levels have new female-centric titles, although ironically, considering that this is a genre in which people tend to like showing off how many words they know, they failed to consider that the feminine form of gladiator is gladiatrix, which also just happens to sound way cooler. And compared to a fighting man, the fighting woman starts out with equal hit dice until level 4, when they fall to a weird variant that puts them about one level behind their male counterparts, and also have a fighting capability which is one level behind that of a male fighter. Except at level 8, where they have the fighting capability of 7 men instead of a superhero -1. And if these values seem a little weird to you, that's because this is a very weird thing. This article was published in late 1976, months after the final Advanced Dungeons & Dragons book had been released. But for some reason, it uses the original chainmail rules for hit dice and fighting capability. And for those of you who are not intimately familiar with Dungeons & Dragons rules for fantastic medieval wargames campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures, well, I've done 3 videos on it so far, so I should probably be good at explaining it. The original game, by default, ran on the combat mechanics of the wargame Chainmail. However, that original book also had an alternate combat system, which is the earliest form of the D20-based system that we are all familiar with. The very weird part being that while the chainmail rules were default, they were not included in the book, but the alternate rules were. So it all came down to, I guess, do you have chainmail or do you have a D20? However, with the release of the various supplements, the alternate combat system was the one that got further refined with new optional rules, and the chainmail rules just kind of were still there. And this article does take the new rules into consideration, stating that if the chainmail system is used, tables are wholly correct. If the alternate combat system is used, subtract 1 level from all levels over 1 in every combat. If this is not done, females would fight as well as a man at the same level for far fewer experience points. And that is another thing. The female variant classes do have lower experience point values for their levels. Kinda. The big exception to that rule being magic users and thieves, who do progress faster than their male counterparts up to a specific level, 5 and 8 respectively, at which point they actually progress slower. And I want you to keep that in mind because, remember, according to that blurb, that faster progression is supposed to be the thing that makes up for them being overall physically weaker. And while it does take into consideration the alternate combat system, it doesn't take into consideration the alternate hit point system, which, once again, had somewhat become the standard at the time. Like, this same issue of The Dragon features numerous other articles that do treat the alternate hit point rules as standard. So it is a little weird to see this article from after the entire run of original Dungeons & Dragons defaulting back to those original rules and largely ignoring all of the refinements that had been made to the rules since the original release. Anyway, on to the other differences. Women are allowed 1,000 points of encumbrance, plus 50 times strength rating at no movement loss. If you are not familiar with original Dungeons & Dragons, encumbrance was given in coin weight at the time. And here's the funny thing, The standard rules for encumbrance just set the default amount at 1500, meaning that a female character with a strength score above 10 actually has a higher carrying capacity than a male character. Although taking into account the strength bonuses to carrying capacity rules from Greyhawk, a male character will eventually outclass a female one in carrying capacity, and female characters also have a maximum load equal to 1.8 times their encumbrance score. I don't remember what the max load is in the base rules. I'm just going to assume that it's 2. Female characters with a strength score of 10 or lower also take a -1 penalty to attacks with Flail, Battle Axe, and Morning Stars, and -2 to Polearms, Halberd, Pike, and Two-Handed Sword, as well as a 20% greater fatigue rating on plate armor, with a score of 11 or 12 reducing those by 1 and 10% respectively, and female characters with strength of 11 or lower increasing the fatigue rating of Chainmail by 10%. Also, all women wield a dagger at an additional +1, which means that if you are using the alternate combat rules, female characters will at times, even with their -1 level penalty, have a higher attack bonus than a male character with a similar strength score. And if you are not using the alternate damage rules from Greyhawk, all weapons just do a d6 damage, so that's a weird thing. And I'm sure that spells column on the table is really piquing your interest, but that is a thing I will get to later. Clerics and magic users aren't really all that interesting. Once again, female clerics are about 1 level behind their male counterparts in terms of fighting capability, and have a weird variation of the hit points that keeps them a little bit behind as well. And the weird part, they get more and higher level spells earlier, but then pretty soon start falling behind a male cleric. And now for the kind of content you've all been waiting for, female clerics also gain access to the spell Worship, which allows them to put all men within 12 inches, which let's just say 60 feet, into an idolizing trance for 4 + 1d8 turns, provided she has a beauty score of 11 or higher, and also is chaotically aligned, as neutral and lawful clerics are never permitted to use their female charms, and in fact retain charisma instead of beauty. Although it is not specified if their charisma is supposed to be rolled with 3d6 or with the 2d10. And magic users are really weird. Compared to a male magic user, their hit points actually start out the same, but then fall behind at level 11 and actually pull ahead at level 14. Their fighting capacity starts 2 levels behind, but then at varying points catches up and even surpasses a male magic user before going back down. They also get fewer lower level spells, more higher level spells, and access to level 5, 6, 7, and 8 spells 1 level earlier. But remember, actually have a slower progression. Maybe. Here's the thing. Experience points above 13th level are comparable to male magic users, and powers are nearly equal. You may make them equal, in fact, with no problem, beginning with Witch level 13 equals Wizard level 13. But there's actually no experience point values provided for base magic users above 11. And no obvious way to extrapolate the values provided into ones that are comparable to what's given here. So it's one of those things that is just honestly an issue with original Dungeons & Dragons in general that I will address later. And then of course there are some new spells for this new type of magic user, the expected exotic powers of dark femininity spells, but then also there's just a handful of random spells that are even specified to be available to any magic users, because This article, I guess, made too much sense, so they just decided to throw in some filler content. And I'm sure you're just itching to hear about all of those female-specific spells, but I am saving those until after we discuss the most interesting of these classes, the Female Thief. Now, the Thief is really notable for being the first class added to Dungeons & Dragons. It is not in the core books, it is in the first supplement, Greyhawk. And this is going to come up a lot, so I figured it was something that was worth noting right here at the beginning. And remember how I made a big deal about how the female magic user has more listed levels than the base magic user? Well, the Female Thief, for some reason, has fewer. Now, as for hit points, remember how I mentioned that this article doesn't seem to take into account the alternate hit point system from Greyhawk? Well, the Thief, which as mentioned was introduced in Greyhawk, is only provided with the alternate hit point system, so we don't even have original rule hit dice to compare to. Once again, fighting capability is one level behind the male version, except at one level where it's a weird variation. And as you may have once again noticed, female thieves gain access to spells. Or rather, they gain access to spells if they have an intelligence score of 12 or higher. The exceptions being the spells Seduction, Charm Men, and Charm Humanoid Monster, which only require an intelligence score of 9 in addition to a beauty score of 13. But now, let's look into all of these special spells. Starting with the least yikes one, Tarot Reading, which just allows you to, via reading the tarot cards, ascertain the answer to a yes or no question with accuracy based on a d12 roll. So if I understand the rules of how this one works correctly, if you ask the cards if, I don't know, the Hobgoblin army is going to attack before your reinforcements arrive, and they will, then a roll of 1 through 6 is yes, 7 through 10 is probably yes, and 11 or 12 probably no. So it's actually a fairly useful spell. But now let's move on to the moderate yikes spells, starting with Seduction, which is an 8-level spell which enchants the victim to remove his armor and lay down his weapons and attempt an encounter with the lady. So, a lot to unpack with this one. Obviously, it is specified to only be usable by a woman on a man, and whether or not the spell can actually be used is dependent on the caster's beauty score and the race of the caster and target. So, if the caster were a hobbit trying to cast the spell on an elf, she would need to have a beauty score of 14 to even cast the spell. And all those values on the table are increased by 2 for thieves, 4 for fighters, and female orc thieves cannot seduce an elf, nor can a fighter. Also, are there character rules for orcs somewhere? Because I went through every single original Dungeons & Dragons book and article up until this magazine, and I don't recall ever seeing any. Also, I just want to point out that this article severely underestimates orcish sex appeal. And then there is a save based on the caster's beauty score and spell number, and the target's class and wisdom score. And that is why orc character rules are so important here. Monsters did not have wisdom scores back then. And then the rules for those saves are either wrong or dumb. I mean, like, yeah, far be it from me to tell some dude from 1976 that his hastily thrown together rules are wrong, but if you sum seduction and beauty scores, subtract the wisdom of the target figure and add the product to a 20-sided die roll, and then need to roll a specific value or higher to save, and not get laid, lol. Doesn't that mean that the higher the spell number and beauty score and lower the wisdom, the easier the save is? Anyway, assuming that you are supposed to subtract that value from the roll or add it to the target, affected creatures will be affected for a number of turns based on the caster's caster level. So moving on to Charm Men, which is used versus hirelings and low-level fighters, thieves, and magic users, which has 3 versions, and as far as I understand, has a range of 16 inches and affects a number of targets with a number of hit dice for a duration, all based on spell level. With affected targets either attacking unaffected men within range with more hit dice, or if none are in range, going catatonic. But now for the complicated part. After 2 rounds of catatonia, a hireling can be taken over, which I assume means controlled by the caster. Unless a higher level male figure with a charisma score equal to or greater than the caster's beauty is able to snap the bros out of it. Let's just call him the alpha. Rolling a d8, adding the difference between beauty and charisma, and succeeding on a 6 or higher. And then to even use this spell, magic users need to have a beauty score of 11, thieves 13, and fighters 16. And now for the most yikes spell, Charm Humanoid Monster, which may be used on the following male monsters: hobgoblins, ogres, trolls, giants, mummies, vampires, gargoyles, werewolves, either shape, werebear, man only, lizard men, and centaurs. So I guess someone isn't a fan of Canadian literature. And has one of 2 effects. Either the monster will go catatonic for 1 to 4 rounds, or disarm and carry off the woman to its lair, which has an indefinite duration. And if she tries to fight, an 8 or higher on a 20-sided die will mean that he'll try to kill her, or if a 9+, he will try to grapple her and may harm her, 50% chance. I would really like to criticize the writing here, but honestly this isn't bad by the standards of original D&D, unfortunately. The specific effect being determined by adding the caster's beauty and spell level, and then subtracting the monster's level, with vampires, gargoyles, and centaurs treating their level as 2 higher, and then adding that value to a d20 roll. Being carried off on a result of 12 through 16, catatonic on a result of 17 or higher, and presumably no effect on an 11 or lower. Of course, there is the small problem that monsters, humanoid or not, do not actually have levels in original Dungeons & Dragons. The Wandering Monster tables are separated by level, or rather the dungeon Wandering Monster tables are, the other Wandering Monster tables are not. So, some of the monsters that are listed here do have listed levels in one of the books, and the others don't. And also, the very specific getting what she deserves aspects of this spell are a thing that I don't think I really need to go into, because either you understood it immediately, or no amount of explanation is going to convince you why this is bad. And finally, Horrid Beauty, which compared to the other spells, doesn't seem that bad. And notably, is the only beauty-based skill that you can actually use if you have a below average beauty score, and also gives you convenient ratings for those beauty scores, with grotesque and ugly witches either scaring a target to death or making them flee, and then, of course, beautiful and gorgeous witches seducing them. And ordinary witches do either effect on a 50-50 basis, which is weird because I was under the impression that there were 4 effects because there are 4 effects listed, but I guess I was wrong. So those are all of the spells, and now let's go back to the very beginning and look at the fighting women and their spells that they may or may not have. Magic users have spells per day and a spell list. Clerics have spells per day and a spell list, with worship being specified that it's added as a 4th level spell. Thieves have spells per day and a spell list. Fighters of 4th level and higher only have special for beautiful women, with the only specification being fighting women may incorporate the spells of seduction, charm men, or charm humanoid monster, depending on their level and beauty scores. See spells of seduction at all. And then the only specification given in the spells is those minimum beauty scores that I pointed out. So, how does a female fighter use these spells? Because seduction and charm men work on spell number and charm humanoid monster spell level. But we don't have any indication of what level these spells might be cast at, or which numbers of the spells the fighter would have access to. Only that they can access those spells with a sufficient beauty score. So we do know that a battle maiden with 20 beauty can access those spells, but not any of the actual details about how they are cast and at what levels, which essentially means they can't cast the spells until you sit down and figure all of that out for yourself. And let's be honest here, are you? Is this content worth the effort it would require to house rule it? So yeah, that's it, and it was certainly a thing. The first official attempt at adding V to D&D. And I'm just going to start now by going over it objectively as game content. Basically, like everything else in original Dungeons & Dragons, there is the issue that there are a lot of gaps in the published rules that DMs had to fill in themselves. And that includes DMs that were also publishing official content. So a lot of the content you get for this game is built upon a version of the rules that nobody actually has access to outside of the designer's personal game. As I pointed out, it uses the Thief class from Greyhawk, but also just ignores the alternate hit die and hit point accumulation rules also from Greyhawk, which once again are the only hit dice given for the Thief. Unless this is based on the original version of the Thief that was published in the Great Plains Game Players newsletter, or perhaps even some earlier version of the Thief that only existed in playtest materials, which I guess could explain how the Thief was mistakenly attributed to Blackmore twice, but not how they had the correct page in the wrong book, or how someone at TSR didn't catch that and correct it before printing this in a magazine. Like, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that anyone publishing official content for Dungeons & Dragons should know which one of the 3 supplements the only additional class appeared in. Like, I'm sure centaurs do have a level somewhere in the notes of the designer's home game, or maybe at their table, hit dice and level had become interchangeable terms. Having orcs as a player race would be super easy to just house rule on your own. However, the fact that orcs are separated out into the Charm Men spell, whereas hobgoblins are not, implies that orcs as player characters was a standard part of the version of the game that this article was written for. And I'm sure that the levels and uses per day of the Lady Fighter spells were so obvious to the designer that they just overlooked putting them in, or I don't know, cut them for more filler content. And I don't want to say that at this point the Dragon was basically just a vanity publication for Gary Gygax and his friends, but it kinda was. Quality control wasn't really a thing, more so just, we'll print whatever you give us. And you know what, just for funsies, why don't I rate all of these variant female classes? So, Lady Fighter, 1 out of 6. Basically unplayable, and or completely overpowered, depending on how you interpret their mysterious spellcasting abilities. Lady Cleric, also 1 out of 6. Once again, they just made them weaker overall. You get a little bit of a bump early on, but that is very quickly lost. And the only advantage you get is that worship spell, which is only usable if you have a beauty score of 11 or higher, and are chaotically aligned. And even if you do meet those qualifications, that one spell is not really worth all you have to give up to get it. Lady Magic User, 2 out of 6. The downsides here are not as severe, but neither are the benefits. You basically just get an additional handful of spells that you can use, if you have a sufficient beauty score. The only guaranteed benefit you are going to get from being a female magic user is horrid beauty, and even then, that's not great. And finally, Lady Thief, 3 out of 6. This is really the only class that seems to have any actual thought put into it. Like, regardless of how coded it is, or rather, because of that, it really does seem like there was a clear vision of what a female thief was when it was being designed, versus all of the others that seem really like an afterthought more so than anything else. It is the only class here that actually has worthwhile benefits to make up for its shortcomings, provided you have the necessary intelligence and or beauty scores. And also, +1 to attacks with daggers is probably going to be useful for a thief. It says all women, and that should include thieves. So yeah, that was me looking at it as game content. Now let's look at it as an artifact of 1976 gaming. Like a lot of problematic content in TTRPGs, even today, I am willing to give them the benefit of a doubt here and say that the intent was not malicious. Just someone writing what they believe to be true based on their obviously correct opinions. It just happens to be that those views are from the perspective of someone whose experiences with women seem to be primarily with female characters written by male science fiction and fantasy writers. Or even worse, female NPCs played by DMs who are angry about the fact that Jerry doesn't come around as much anymore since he got that girlfriend. And that perspective presented here is one in which women are inherently immoral and manipulative. Except the good ones, of course. Remember, it is explicitly stated that lawful and even neutral clerics are not permitted to use their female charms. Not just cannot use the worship spell, but female charms at all. It is a perspective that clearly views femininity not just as a weapon, but as a deceitful weapon, one that a virtuous woman would never even dream of using. And I know I've been using this word a lot in this particular video, but it is weird how the vision of female characters here boils down to being physically weaker and compensating for that with not just female charms, but supernatural seduction powers. As I said, the thief is at least based on an existing archetype, and the magic user and cleric, well, There are plenty of examples of seductive enchantresses and evil priestesses in fantasy, but why does the female fighter have magic seduction powers? You know, if you can figure out how to use them. Because the beauty score is really one of the most interesting aspects here, and one that I think reveals a lot about the perspective behind this design. Like, even putting aside the whole beauty is the female equivalent of charisma thing, pretty much all of the unique benefits that female characters get are dependent on having an above-average beauty score. The beautiful woman of any class is given the supernatural ability to manipulate men with their devious femininity, but a woman with a below-average beauty score can, at best, be ugly enough to scare someone to death. Essentially, it seems like what they're getting at here is that an unattractive woman is one who has been disarmed of her only advantage. And remember, we are talking about magic seduction here, that for some reason only works with a sufficiently high beauty score. Like, Charm Person does not require you to have a minimum charisma score, because it is a magic spell. It is not dependent on your natural charisma. But in these rules, a woman doesn't even have charisma. Her personality and strength of character deemed insignificant compared to her appearance. Appearance that is so central to the female character's power that it somehow supersedes the normal rules of magic. Or rather, is a form of magic in itself? And something that I feel is an important note right here, there is literally nothing preventing them from just adding beauty as a 7th attribute in addition to charisma, like they did in 1st edition with comeliness, or in the Book of Erotic Fantasy with appearance. In fact, if anything, there was less restriction back then telling them that they can't add a 7th ability score. Overall, this whole thing just feels like it's way more interested in meeting expectations that male players have about female characters than it is in actually bringing the distaff gamer into D&D. A thing that I feel like it would not be controversial to say was not a priority at the time. And thank you for watching. If you want more of my special brand of wit and insight, you can follow me on Blue Sky, Twitter, even Tumblr. Especially Tumblr. There are links in the description. And extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Hasterfan, Mix Woofers, Nikolai Snowtail, Randy Mulholland, Renee D, Sean Betts, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshirokuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon. Also, channel memberships are now a thing, so you can check those out too. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that the dark, unseen hand of the YouTube algorithm has lovingly selected for you, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.